Welcome everyone to the channel. I just want to say I appreciate you guys being here for just a couple minutes of your day. I appreciate you guys. This is a book review for Eragon, the first book of the Inheritance Cycle. I don't know why I could not pronounce that. It's the first book. I actually own this book since it came out. I never read it, so I decided to finally read it. And I'm going to give you all my thoughts about it, and we're going to go from there. I tried to go in open-minded. And what I mean by that is, I know this book is written for young adults and kids. It definitely is. And that's when as soon as I started reading it, I instantly was like, oh yeah, this is not for me. But I went in there with an open-minded and tried to ignore those parts because I was reading some reviews on this after I finished reading it. A lot of people gave it like 1 or 2 stars because they're like, oh, it's tropey of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. It's clearly inspired by those. And I'm like, you give that same inspirations. You are fine with that for when it's an adult fantasy or adult sci-fi. And to me, it's just interesting. Like, for examples, like people are like, oh, the Eye of the World is definitely inspired from Lord of the Rings. And people give that like 4 or 5 stars, you know what I'm saying? But Eragon is like a 1 or 2 star because it's the same tropes as the Wheel of Time. I'm not trying to compare the two of them. I'm just trying to like make sense of why people are giving 1 star to one book, especially one that's towards kids and young adults. Like, that's just what I was thinking when I was getting myself into it. Now, I always usually talk about like what I like and what I dislike about this book. The thing is, with dislikes, I could sit there and say, oh, it's super tropey, which it is. It has everything you expect in a fantasy book. Tropey as all get up. Farm boy that's gonna be a hero. He's like the savior. Dragons, lost artifacts, different races, and it has everything that you expect in it. And like a rebel team that's like it's a lot like Star Wars with Lord of the Rings mixed. That's a really good example, I thought, when I was reading this, of like the combination of what these are, except it was dragons, so it was really dope. My first thought when I was reading this was, let's go in there with open mind, like I said before, but this is my first fantasy book that has dragons in it, which is weird because for a guy who reads a lot of fantasy, I don't really get the dragons, because everyone talks about there's always a lot of dragons in fantasy. I never experienced it, so this is my first time ever experiencing dragon fantasy, and I'm going to tell you, I actually enjoyed quite a bit of it. I think the way, and I gotta put this out there, Christopher Paolini writing this at 15 years old is crazy. When I was 15, I was busy playing like NCAA and playing Call of Duty Black Ops. So this guy was like eons ahead of a lot of 15-year-olds. I will say, like, yes, how he writes these books, this book is really, like, you can definitely tell it's someone younger that wrote it. And I don't think there's any problem with that. It's a really easy book to get into. For myself, as an adult, yeah, I went in there with like, oh, yeah, I've read this a million times. But if you were younger, like, I could imagine if I was 15 or even 14 reading this, and this was my first time getting into a fantasy novel, yeah, this book would just be such a high, like, bar for me for every other fantasy book I'll ever read. Someone who has read a lot of fantasy now sees all these tropes and stuff, and then I'm like, oh, okay, it's not as special, but it's still fine to me. Like I said, it's kind of like where I was reading this, I was like, oh, okay, there's some elements to this book that I've never experienced because I've never read anything with dragon fantasy. And after I read it, I was like, oh, so now this is how probably a lot of dragon fantasy is, where the main character will find an egg, the egg will hatch, and that's how he meets the dragon. Or it's going to be something along those lines. That was kind of like my idea when I was reading this one, of how the rest of the dragon fantasy books are kind of like. And it made me want to read adult fantasy with dragons in it. It's not like I was against it. I just never did, because a lot of popular fantasy books, modern age fantasy books, doesn't really do the dragons a lot. And I'm not like against modern fantasy, but I like both. I like both fantasy, but modern fantasy doesn't do as much. It's more of like ripping off the Game of Thrones style, where it just has to be grim dark. So reading something that isn't grim dark and it was just kind of fun, I guess it's the best way that I can explain Eragon. It's fun. It's not like, wow, it's not turning the wheel. It's definitely not, but it's just fun. Like that's why I really enjoyed with this book the most. It was fun. Eragon as a character himself was fine. You can definitely tell, like, Christopher Paolini did a lot of influence of Frodo, of Luke Skywalker. Like, you can definitely see that in this book. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. Like, for myself, I'm not trying to like say I'm doing it better or I'm doing it worse. But when I was writing my book series, I took a lot of inspirations from different characters. Like my main character was inspired from like Aragorn and Geralt were like two really strong ones I wanted to influence him from. So I don't see anything wrong when you're doing that. Like I said, there's a lot of people that always compare a lot of these books. They're like, oh, he's doing all these, so I'm going to give him a bad rating. Agree with that? Also, spoilers. We're going to get to a little bit of spoilers in this because now I'm actually going to talk about the book itself. I want to talk about the outside of the book, but now the meat of the book. So there's a few things in this book that I thought, I was like, it was very predictable, especially for someone who has read a lot of fantasy. It was very predictable. And that was like the problem for me a little bit. And there was a few things I didn't really like. So when you meet Eragon, he's just a boy, you know, he's just a teenage boy. And he gets this stone, which is the egg for his dragon, is Saphira. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Eventually you meet her. When he gets the egg, he doesn't know what to do. He's gonna sell it, and no one knows what it is except for this guy named Braum. Now you meet Braum, and he's the storyteller. And what happens is there's shades that attack the village and kills Eragon's father. It's not really his father, it's like his adopted dad. Obviously for me, I didn't feel like I'm like, oh my gosh, because throughout after that, Eragon didn't really think about it too much after. Like usually after you lose your father or your father figure, you end up being like, man, and it really will weigh on you a lot. But it didn't really do that for Eragon a lot throughout this book. Which I'm not sitting here saying like he has to be like mourning him, but there's a lot of times when characters, even humans, when we lose someone that we love, like our parents, or just anyone that we thought was like a father figure or a mother figure, you're gonna think about him quite a bit. And he didn't really do that too much. Like he did it at first, like the first like 2 chapters, and then he just got over it and he was just doing his own thing. But at the same time, he's a 15-year-old boy, so I was thinking, oh, maybe it's just because he's a little different. And he's experiencing so much things in this new world that he might not understand the real reality of losing his father figure, I should say. And that's why I was trying to like understand why he might not be doing it. Like I said, I'm trying to be open-minded about all this. You learn more about this world going through. Like the world building's actually pretty good for a 15-year-old. You learn a lot. And that's what I thought about this book is the pacing's really quick. Like chapters are brisk, which is really nice. Problem is though, when he's doing that, he's just throwing so many things at you at once where you feel like you're almost overwhelmed, but you're not. You kind of feel like, oh, we're learning so many things at once. So it's kind of overwhelming, but it's not at the same time. He does a really good job at making it digestible for you. But at the same time, it's like, why are we learning about so many things? Like I said, when Eragon leaves, he goes with the man named Braum. And Braum eventually gets killed. It was like halfway through the book, and he was trying to make it like impactful again. And to me, I was like, you killed his dad like 150 pages before. Now you're gonna kill, I guess, his mentor now. And I just didn't feel like that was a good choice. It just didn't, I don't know, I didn't really like him killing Braum that early because it didn't feel like I was like, oh man. I wasn't sad. I was like, oh, all right, he's dead now. I didn't feel that attachment like I thought I would, which is what maybe he was trying to convey. And I think maybe it's because he's writing it for a younger audience, so it might be more impactful. Because like for me, when I'm reading adult fantasy, if you have one character in that book and then they die eventually, that's where it's really impactful. Like reading the Dresden Files, so many good characters in that have made me almost tear up because it was so deep. And I just couldn't believe, like, oh man, this happened to this character. And that's what I was thinking, maybe that's why the difference is. And like I said, I wasn't griping over that, but it was just like in my head with it. And then you meet this other character named Murtagh. I think that's how it's pronounced him. And he actually has a book that is out. So I'm going to read that if I really like this whole series. We'll see at the end of the 4th book. Murtagh shows up and he's like Morzan's son, and Morzan's like a really bad guy, which you learn a lot about this whole series. And I'm actually excited to see where this goes. A lot of people say that after book 2, no one reads it. So I'm like, why? That's kind of like my idea is like, why? I need to know why. But I'm trying to pace myself out. I'm going to try to read these series every 2 months, I think I have it. Because November is when I read the 4th book. And that same month is when I finish the last book of The Wheel of Time. And if I like the 4th book of that, I might read Murtagh in December. We'll see. With all this going on, you meet a lot of characters. You meet elves. You meet an elf named Ara. And if I remember, there's this witch, like witch doctor, witch lady that name is Angela, who tells Eragon his fortune that he's going to meet a woman that he's going to fall in love with. And he ends up meeting two girls, and one was the elf is Ara. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Arya? Arya? That's how I kept pronouncing it. And I'm assuming that's who he's going to hook up with. And then he met another girl. So I'm like, is this going to be a love triangle? I'm like, God, I hope not. I hate love triangles. The whole general thing of this book, though, is it's just an adventure. If you like D&D, that's what it kind of is. They made me feel like it was just a D&D adventure. And you kind of learn things along the way. I think there's some parts of this where it could have been a little dragged out. Like, I think Braum should have like died maybe in book 2, not in book 1, which is fine still. I'm not like against it. It's like obviously the book sold millions and he did a great job. He literally doesn't have to write again. He doesn't have to do anything. He could just chill for the rest of his life because he wrote such a successful book series, which is cool. All in all, I really did enjoy this book. I give it a 4 out of 5 stars, which was pretty cool. I mean, the more I think about it, I think it would be lean more to like a 3.5-ish to 4 stars, somewhere around there. It just depends on my day. But all in all, it was a fun introduction to the series. If you are my age, which is 28 or a little younger, this book might not be for you just because it's too old. Like, you're going to be too old to like actually enjoy it, and you probably have read plenty of fantasy books. But honestly, if someone who's never read a dragon fantasy, but they read like romance fantasy, this might be a book that you might actually enjoy because it's a great introduction to fantasy. I always sit back and think of like, what's the best kind of books to introduce you into fantasy? And a lot of people pick like Lord of the Rings, or I always pick like the Dresden Files. Dresden Files is great to get into, but honestly, now reading Eragon, I think Eragon would be like the best. Like, if I had someone even my age was like, hey, what's a fantasy series should I get into? I would probably say Harry Potter or Eragon. I think they're both great. Those are both great introductions. If you made it to the end of the video, I do appreciate it. Make sure you guys check out all my socials down below. Let me know how you guys liked Eragon, if you guys have read it yet, or are you guys not going to read Eragon? If you are, please let me know down below. That'd be awesome. And of course, make sure you guys stay safe, stay hungry, and tell someone you love them. I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.